Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast Network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast. Ozcast. Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.
I even love the smell of books. Hello, welcome to Sundoku, the podcast for addicted readers. I'm Annie Hastwell.
And I'm Michaela Andreev.
And Sundoku, you ask? Well, if you're someone who always needs to have a book at hand, you've probably got a pile of books next to your bed. And they're all the books that you're planning to read or have dipped into and are going to get to later.
Well, I've certainly got one of those. Mine is so big that it's actually moved into the top drawer of my bedside table. A few of them are collecting dust, and I know that this is all just my book saying to me, clearly your eyes are bigger than your ability to read all of us.
And the Japanese have a wonderful word for that aspirational pile of books. They call it a sundoku.
And let's remember, it mightn't just be books piled up beside your bed. You might have a whole load of audiobooks on hold with your local library. You might have a stack of books piled up on your Kindle. That is a sundoku as well. It's wherever you pile up the books you're waiting to read.
In Sundoku, we'll talk to authors of the moment, but we'll also revisit some of the classics, books that were a really big hit in their day. We'll chat them back into life, work out what made them such a hit then and why we've forgotten them.
Today, Picnic at Hanging Rock. This is an eerie Aussie classic that hit the zeitgeist back in the 1960s.
Traditional Gothic conjures up images of vampires, crumbling castles on English landscapes, moors, dark nights, confined spaces, being trapped in places that you can't get out of. But this is what I would call an Australian Gothic.
We'll also hear from avid readers from all walks of life and all ages on how they acquired their reading passion, what their all-time favourites are, and what books they have waiting next to their bed in their sundoku.
On the side of my bed at the moment, I have a large stack. The bottom of it is The Once and Future King, which is a gift from my late grandmother, which I haven't got around to reading again yet. A parenting book of some sort. I think I dusted off the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People to try and get organised.
But right now, Michaela, you caught up with Lebanese-Australian author Michael Mohammed Ahmad to talk about his new book.
Yeah, it's called The Other Half of You, and it's the final book in a trilogy that centres on the life and times of the Adam family, as seen through the eyes of its second son, Barney Adam. Barney's family are Alawite Muslims. They live in the western suburbs of Sydney, but they originally hail from Lebanon. And each member of Barney's family is grappling with issues of faith and tradition and culture, and they're grappling with it in different ways in the context of contemporary Australia. Mohammed's books are poetic, they're original, and they're just so honest. I caught up with Mohammed at Adelaide Writers' Week. Salam alaikum, Mohammed.
Wa alaikum assalam. Thank you for having me, and I also would like to say beautiful pronunciation.
Thank you very much. Mohammed, tell me, who is Barney Adam?
I work in the form called autobiographical fiction. So the stories that I've been telling for the last 10 years are based on my real life. They're based on the experiences of being an Arab and Muslim man growing up in the western suburbs of Sydney. But my main work is in the craft of creative writing. On that basis, I created the fictional character Barney Adam as my autobiographical alter ego. Up until very recently, the general portrayal of Arab and Muslim men, not just in Australia but around the world, has always been a very one-dimensional one. It's been one that is affiliated with terrorism, misogyny, violence. In the Australian context, there are stereotypes of Arab and Muslim men being sexual predators, gangsters, drug dealers. And it's not like there aren't some examples where those types of narratives are true, but it's such a one-dimensional narrative. It's such a small part of a beautiful, complex community. And so the reason I gave my character the name Barney Adam is because it's about reclaiming our humanity and developing a character that is sophisticated and intersectional in the way he engages with the world around him.
And I guess the beauty of that is you've had 3 books to develop that character, and 3 books which through his development, you're seeing the complexity of his world and what it is to grow up and the choices that he must face. I know at the beginning of the Lebs, we learned that Barney thinks he is better than his peers. And I think by the end of it, he's possibly more confused than ever. He's not quite able to just define himself and who he's becoming. Is he a boxer? Is he an artist? Is he a free spirit? Is he a devout Muslim? In the third book, would you say that Barney does reconcile with who he is?
Yeah, thank you. There's a lot in there, so I'll break it down. So the first component of that is to talk about the 3 books. And the first book, The Tribe, is Barney as a child. The second book, The Lebs, is Barney as a teenager. And the third book, The Other Half of You, is Barney as a man. But I wrote each novel standalone, so you don't have to read all 3. The idea for me was showing the full life of a boy becoming a man, specifically in a racialized context for Barney as an Arab and as a Muslim man. Now, with the Tribe, it's a quite a innocent book, and it's very restricted because Barney's a child, so his world is basically his family and it's his house. In the Lebs, the story is about being a teenager, which is already difficult for any teenager, but it's especially difficult for an Arab and a Muslim growing up in the post 9/11 era. That book, The Lebs, looks at the time that Barney is a teenager, a period in the world when the entire media and political spectrum is very heavily scrutinizing these young men, and you see how it plays out. And you see that the book is about Barney trying to distance himself from that community and then ultimately embracing it. And then in The Other Half of You, I absolutely agree, and I appreciate your interpretation that it's really the journey of Barney making sense of who he is, reconciling it, and in the most literal way possible, becoming whole. I mean, the book's called The Other Half of You, and I play with the idea of half quite a lot throughout the book, but it's about how this young man becomes whole and becomes complete.
Yeah, and peace, I think. There's almost a sense of peace growing, not initially, but throughout the book, within him.
I think anybody who reads the book on its own or reads the trilogy will be satisfied with where this ends. I think both The Tribe and The Lebs end pretty openly and end with quite a lot of questions, but I think there's quite a lot of closure and conclusion to The Other Half of You and to Barney's journey, to a point where I don't feel compelled to tell another story in Barney's life.
I must say, when I was reading it, I started to feel it was almost, for me, more of a love letter to Barney's wife. It's almost explaining to her where he has come from and how he has found the other part that completes him. Is that a reasonable thing to assume?
I always appreciate a fresh interpretation of my work. So my answer is always yes. Thank you for that reading of the work. But for me, the idea of it being a letter to his mother, to my son's mother, is true to the extent that she, and this isn't a spoiler, but it's a big factor in the story, is that she's from an the real mother that this is based on, and the fictional mother in the book, whose name's, I won't actually spoil, I won't even say the name because that's a spoiler. Yeah. But the mother of my son that the character is based on is from an Anglo-Australian background and came from a very secular family and also a very middle-class family. And I come from quite a conservative, very poor Arab Muslim family. So it was about coming together. It was about unity and solidarity and love. Here's my case for why the intercultural love story is the story of our time. And if it isn't, why it should be. Because if we just look at, say, like the last 4 years, in 2019, an Australian-born white supremacist went to Christchurch in New Zealand and massacred 51 Muslims peacefully conducting their Friday prayers. The following year, we saw the explosion of the Black Lives Matter movement following the murder of George Floyd. But we also saw how that had an impact on Australia. We've had 500 deaths in custody of Indigenous people in Australia since 1993. We have seen a tremendous rise in anti-Asian violence around the world and in Australia, with thousands of cases reported in Australia against Asian communities. And it's just felt to me that we have never been so divided. I feel like we've been more divided now than even after September 11. And so the idea of telling these love stories that is about coming together, I really think that is the story we need right now. If there's any hope for us as a species, I think it starts with that ability for us to come together, to love each other, and to be able to cut through the intersections, race, class, gender, and sexuality, and find ways to be together.
You talked before about whether there would be another book in this trilogy. There won't be. But I suppose the next step is how in this society that it's increasingly polarised with leaders such as, we don't even have to name them, the leaders around the world. How do you sustain that relationship and that love? The pressures that Barney and his wife will be under, maybe you personally, there must be pressures. It must be hard for everyone.
Thank you. I appreciate that question. So yes, I really feel like, at least for now, my writing journey is complete, at least with these 3 books. And so for me, what's next and how does that tie into your question? I'm really invested in the next generation. So anybody that knows my work knows that my writing is maybe 20% of who I am. And Sweatshop Literacy Movement, which is a program and an organization I set up 10 years ago to empower culturally and linguistically diverse communities, is about the next generation and giving them the tools to read, write, and think critically in order to address some of these issues that are destroying the potential for a functional world. And what I would add is that if anyone's interested in the work of Sweatshop and the beautiful anthologies that we've produced with these amazing young writers in the western suburbs of Sydney who are from Indigenous backgrounds and culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds, to check out the Sweatshop website, which is sweatshop.ws.
Fantastic. And what I love is it's to read, write and to think critically. That's just so important in a time like this where people are being taught to think in bubbles and in, slogans and in short sentences. How would you define thinking critically? Like what's your emphasis there with your students?
It ties in really well with the idea of literacy to me. What is the definition of literacy? I think the conservative and traditional definition of literacy is to be able to put letters together to make words, words together to make sentences, sentences together to make paragraphs, paragraphs together to make pages. But for me, it's the opposite. Reading is the ability to pull the text apart, to deconstruct it, and to understand what it means. And that's what critical thinking is. I mean the ability to understand the information you're being fed. And the last component, which is so important, the writing component, which is about developing some kind of response, developing an alternative to the information you're being fed.
I've heard you say elsewhere that Arabs have lost much of their humanity and dignity in the eyes of others. And with the other half of you, your intention was to restore some of that dignity to Barney's son, but also for your son to draw from. Can you speculate on whether there might have been a different emphasis in this book if your child had been a daughter?
I have never been asked to even think about that before. So I'll need a moment.
Certainly.
What I would say is that I remember when Khalil was born, it was simultaneously the happiest and saddest day of my life. And, you would know from those quite detailed scenes of his birth and that reaction, how intense it can be in those birthing rooms. And the reason it was a very sad day is because I think it was the moment that I began to die. I felt such a sense of loss. I lost myself. Like I felt like I no longer mattered. Up until that point, my life was about me. It was about getting my business in order and sorting myself out. And then after he was born, everything now was about him. And the rest of my life is about my responsibilities to him. Not just making sure he has a happy life, but having a just and moral life.
Yes.
And so I have no idea, literally, if I would have felt the same or less or more of that burden.
Yeah.
Had he been born in a different gender to the one that we identified him with when he was born.
And I certainly wouldn't imagine you'd feel any less. I guess I was curious if in the story if there would be a different emphasis, if there are concerns you have for Arab women that you might be different to the concerns you have for Arab men.
I'd want to answer that. Yeah. So firstly, I think one of the hardest things for me is trying to talk about my writing not as a full picture, but as a piece in a puzzle.
Yes.
Because the assumption that every book has to tick every box, you know, and so there's always a conversation about women in my work. And I'm always very clear that I don't speak for Arab and Muslim women, that I speak as an Arab Muslim man. And so my portrayals of women it's based on the gaze of the men in our community. It's not pretending to be an authority on a woman's perspective. But when I talked about the idea of the puzzle, what is the puzzle of Arab and Muslim literature in Australia? Well, let's go back 12 months. In the last 12 months, The Other Half of You, which is the story of being a man, came out, being an Arab Muslim man. But at the same time that it came out, my sisters, you know, Randa Abdul Fattah, Amani Haydar, Sarah El Sayed released their books. Yes. Randa Abdul Fattah's book was called Coming of Age in the War on Terror. Sarah El Sayed's book was called Muddy People. And Amani Haydar's book is called The Mother Wound. And they all talk about that experience from the perspective of being an Arab and Muslim woman. When we put all those books together, we get a full picture of what this condition, you know, this condition of being an Arab and a Muslim is. And not one book can't do it all. And so I say that my work is a contribution, and my contribution is specifically on the experience of being an Arab and Muslim man.
Yeah. Could we take a step to the left or the right and ask how the process of your writing? How do you write? Are you disciplined certain hours of the day? Are you in a cafe? Are you in an office? How do you write?
Thank you for that question. You know, it's so interesting because there's this romantic idea of writing. You know, this idea of, inspiration and it being a natural God-given talent. I'm very pragmatic about writing. I think those fantasies are nonsense and are counterproductive. And I also think you couldn't get away with it in any other industry. I think there's real artistry and subjectivity and uniqueness in what makes a great boxer, for example. Someone like Muhammad Ali was incredibly creative and unique, but I also think he had to train. I also think he had to use equipment. I also think he had to have a good diet. I also think he needed a trainer. And in the same way, I approach writing as a craft and a skill that needs to be developed. And just like you need a trainer for boxing, you need an editor for writing, a professional editor, not your wife or your mum, you know, reading your work and telling you you're great.
You're fantastic.
Yeah. You need the right diet. It's that 50 Shades of Grey is like KFC, and Carpinteria by Alexis Wright is the vegetables you grow in your backyard in terms of what you're putting in your brain.
Yeah.
But also with diet, it's important to take note of the fact that it's not just reading your favorite books. I'm not going to become a great boxer just by watching Muhammad Ali box. You also need to read nonfiction, and you need to read literary criticism as part of your literary diet. You need equipment. You need your library. You need, you know, your writing tools. So I say, when I teach creative writing, I try and talk about it in a very pragmatic way. You also need skill, and that's something you can learn. You know, when I'm teaching a class and I'm having a debate like this, what I'll ask this class or a room of people who are doubting that actually there's something, that creative writing is something you can learn. What I would say is something like, what's the difference between closed first-person perspective and open third-person perspective? What's the difference between biography, autobiography, and autobiographical fiction? What's the difference between a dead metaphor, a metonym, and an absolute metaphor? Now, these are things you can learn. And if you learn them, you can apply them to your writing. Yeah. And if you apply them to your writing, big surprise, your writing can get better.
Yeah.
So that's what I mean by skill. And so for me, it's not really so much about like the time you write or when do you write. Yeah. I guess it's like, how do you live as a writer? And I know this is going to sound a little bit pretentious, but I think it's objectively true what I'm about to say, that I actually think I never stop writing. I think I'm writing 24 hours a day. And so a good example I can give of that is, I remember when I was writing The Other Half of You, sometimes I'd get stuck on a sentence where I needed to come up with a metaphor. Usually when you're trying to come up with something original, it will take a very long time. So coming up with a creative metaphor to describe someone just for one line, I get stuck just staring at the screen. So I might get up and go for a walk. I might go and have a meal. I might take the rubbish out. I might go up and have a shower. And then it's like it comes to me. It's like, oh, that's a perfect image. Okay,
Yeah.
I got to go back now.
Yeah.
And I'm going to keep writing. But hang on a second. Did I stop writing and take a break and then come back and keep writing? Or actually, did I not stop writing at all? So I do think that we don't actually, real writers don't ever stop. They're just constantly writing. And part of living is part of what it means to be a writer.
Well, it has been an absolute pleasure to talk to someone who does embody the craft of writing, but at the same time who also embodies the change that he wants to see in the world. And I'm so grateful to have met you. Shukran.
And shukran to you for interviewing me and asking such thoughtful and insightful questions. And also salamu alaikum to you, which means peace be upon you in the language of my ancestors. And I extend that salam to all of our wonderful listeners.
Thank you. That was Michael Mohammed Ahmad. I must say that his books have really stayed with me. They're fabulous. And actually, Annie, here's a tip. Listen to the Lebs on audiobook if you can. The narrator, Hazam Shamas, relays the inner Western sort of Lebanese accent just so well. And he reads the passages that are written in Arabic and excerpts from the Quran far better than my imagination could ever do. He's really amazing.
Interesting, isn't it, that some audiobooks do it better than books? It's a bit like the old film and book discussion.
You feel like you're cheating when you listen to an audiobook, but I really think there are cases where it's well worth doing.
Now time to check out the literary archive and speak to the experts.
Today we've got Doctors Kylie Cardell and Lisa Bennett. They're both senior lecturers in creative writing at Flinders University.
We asked them to look back and find us a book that was a star of its time.
Lisa, I was surprised to hear that you've only just read this for the first time. What struck you most about Picnic at Hanging Rock?
The first thing, this is going to sound glib, is that I hadn't had any spoilers, so I didn't know what happened, even though it was written in the 60s and I've been here for 20 years.
Great.
So that was the first surprise. But then what really struck me about the book was how beautifully written it was, how atmospheric and gothic it was, and how the mystery pulls you along and I'm always interested in stories that are unsolved, where you feel this sense of not catharsis at the end, that you think, I really wish I could know more. And so that really struck me, that this is a book that doesn't try to have a contrived pat ending. I was also really surprised that there were so many more characters in the book. I just thought it was mostly about Miranda and the girls. So to find that there were chapters written from the boys' point of view and from the headmaster's point of view, that blew me away. So the whole thing was wonderful.
Yeah. And there's a list of characters at the start of Picnic at Hanging Rock, which I always really enjoy. I can refer back to it and just, who's who in the zoo. So when you touched on it being a Gothic, I think of Gothic and I think of castles and mysteries. How do you describe this as a Gothic?
You're exactly right. That traditional Gothic conjures up images of vampires, crumbling castles on English landscapes, moors, dark nights, confined spaces, being trapped in places that you can't get out of. But this is what I would call an Australian Gothic. Australia, the country, plays a role in creating this sense of the Gothic. So instead of feeling confined and trapped in dark spaces, we get a Gothic sense because the landscape is so open. The sky is so vast. You feel so exposed and vulnerable being out in this potentially dangerous wilderness and landscape. So the whole way through, I had that. Then we get the castle of the boarding school. There are the sort of similarities to traditional Gothic, but it has its own Australian spin, which I just love.
And Kylie, how would you say this compares to the Gothic canon?
Well, I love that you brought up the house, because there is a kind of spooky castle in this story, but it's not as spooky as the landscape. So in Gothic stories, there's always a sense of disorientation and a sense for which there's a force at work that can't be understood. And in some good Gothic stories, that gets resolved, and that's kind of the point. So in Edgar Allan Poe, you usually get to find out what the source of discomfort is, and that's very satisfying. Mm-hmm. In Picnic at Hanging Rock, the Gothic tension comes from the contrast between kind of in some senses, the safety of the house and the vastness and as you said, Lisa, terrifying openness of the environment. And I think what I love about this book is that they're really quite focused on how ill-prepared the young girls are because of the way they've been taught in this very English kind of boarding school that they are in.
And I think that she emphasizes that as well in terms of the dreamy quality of the picnic. Things feel strange, and that's another trait of Gothic fiction where things are real but also kind of uncanny, not quite of this world. And that whole scene while the girls are lazing around in their lovely white dresses and they're
Painting, falling asleep.
Yeah, and they're eating their fill and they're falling asleep, and that is that kind of, they've eaten so much that they're dozing and snoozy, and the watches stop at 12. That's never explained how a couple of watches, what time is it? I don't know, my watch has stopped at 12. So immediately we get this strangeness, like as soon as they arrived there, things weren't quite happening in this timeline anymore, that they've stepped out. And so we're unsettled, even though there's nothing visibly wrong with what they're doing, but we just get uneasy.
Kylie, you touched on this being a Gothic that isn't necessarily resolved in the traditional way that Gothic tales are. And I understand that the author, Joan Lindsay, fed into this sort of mystique of this, well, is this based on a true story? Isn't this based on a true story?
Well, Joan Lindsay never said it was, but there's a kind of mythicness to the story of lost children in the bush. It wasn't based on a true story that anyone's been able to pinpoint. There's kind of a sense in which this is like, if you go out in the bush, you could disappear. Like almost a tale told to scare children, to stop them from wandering off.
A cautionary
tale.
And I think it was you, Kylie, that told me that when the book was first written, there were 18 chapters, but only 17 were published. So the ending that we all know is not the ending that the author originally had in mind.
Yeah, so Joan Lindsay was advised by her publisher to not publish the book with chapter 18. And this is a chapter that was subsequently published, but when the book came out, there's a very ambiguous ending, and as Lisa said, it's a very, I think, satisfying, and it fits the mystery of the novel, but you're not really, why, where have they gone, what could have happened to them. In fact, theories abound, and there's almost a cottage industry in people trying to figure out, right from alien abduction to other kinds of theories of what happened to the girls on the rock. Joan Lindsay did publish the book without that final chapter, but after her death, and she apparently did give permission for this, chapter 18 was published. And I remember as a girl, begging my school librarian to order in chapter 18 so I could finally, unlike Lisa, figure out what did happen. And I did read it, and I'm not going to say too much about it.
Don't tell us.
So would you read that final chapter?
And we've talked about this before, but I don't want to know. I think one of the things that captured me so much about this book is that it isn't in its original incarnation. It isn't resolved. It's the girls vanish without a trace, and that's so frustrating. And you think, okay, so what happens? Are we going to find the kids in the bush? And what happens throughout? Are there any clues? And not having some sort of even satisfying, wonderful resolution to that, I think would ruin the delicate, creepy, atmospheric mystery that she's built up in the 17 chapters. So I don't want to know. But I am also a person who doesn't read blurbs or watch previews or anything like that. So
I think that, the uncanniness of this story is actually its main power. I don't think chapter 18 spoils that necessarily. That might be a spoiler in itself. Yeah. But I think that it was the right decision. Joan's publisher knew what she was doing. And certainly the book has lived large in Australian imagination. And I think if you haven't read it before, it's a really fascinating look into life at this time. I found it really, really interesting to hear the way people are speaking to each other. It's set in the early 19th century and a kind of almost in between time, right? So things are still, people have settled and established and they're making good livings and the big world wars haven't happened and, it's kind of almost a very nostalgic time. And so Joan wrote that knowing there was a nostalgia for this time, but she imbues it with this creepiness and uncanniness that still, I think, fits with how we think about that contrast between city and bush in Australian life, that it takes a certain kind of person or a certain kind of character to survive in the harshness of the Australian outback, and that can be a badge of honour or it can be your undoing.
Lisa Bennett and Kylie Cardell, they're both senior lecturers in creative writing at Flinders University, and they were discussing the elegantly creepy Australian classic, Picnic at Hanging Rock. And that's a book, Michaela, that I actually thought it was all true. I wasn't alone there, I'm sure.
No, I think most of Australia thinks that. And I think that the author was really actually trying to encourage us all to think it was true, just to add to the mystique of it all.
And certainly if you go to Hanging Rock, it is true. It feels true. It's a very spooky place indeed.
It is. But let's get back to what makes a book addict. So let's enter the minds of some passionate readers from all walks of life. Let's ask them what they're reading and what's on their sundoku.
Hi, I'm Patrick. I'm 40 years old. So reading plays a really big part of my life. I started reading with Asterix and Tintin books, actually, and I think that's what inspired me to start reading. Was my dad used to read them to me, and I learnt to read so that I could read them to myself, and then progressed through Enid Blyton and the kind of English classics. Yeah, and then it was a quick jump into kind of Tolkien and The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. And I also, like, some of my fondest memories of reading as a kid are actually the young adult. There's some quite edgy young adult books that were around when I was a kid, like Space Demons, Gillian Rubinstein and Taronga, and books that were kind of bordering on sci-fi but aimed at 12-year-olds. Playing Beatty Bow, The Galax Arena. There's a whole range of really edgy young adult books that were quite inspiring as a maturing reader, I guess. So I'd say my reading is very wide as an adult. I love science fiction, so probably some of the best books I've ever read are science fiction, but also some of the Jared Diamond books, so popular. Not really a big historical reader. I don't really read the big World War II epics. On my best books that I've ever read, the number one would be, or the top five would be, as authors, would be Donna Tartt, so The Secret History or The Goldfinch, Jonathan Franzen, so probably The Corrections or Freedom, The Three-Body Problem, which is a Chinese science fiction trilogy, which is incredible, probably up there, and The Bone Clocks by David Mitchell would probably be. And then if you like expanding that a little bit, Jared Diamond, Guns, Germs and Steel by Jared Diamond is probably the best non-fiction book. On the side of my bed at the moment, I have a large stack. The bottom of it is The Once and Future King, which is a gift from my late grandmother, which I haven't got around to reading again yet. A parenting book of some sort. I think I dusted off The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People to try and get organised. And William Boyd Trio. I'm not actually reading any of them. They're just there to guilt me into being a better person. But I just read Boy Swallows Universe by Trent Dalton. I just picked up on an unplanned holiday. Absolute love Boy Swallows Universe. I know Brisbane reasonably well, and my wife's from Brisbane. And yeah, great Tarantino-esque kind of Aussie suburban thriller. Yeah, really good. My kids both read. My eldest daughter is similar to me, just reads anything and everything she can get her hands on. So just constantly churns through everything. I've tried to introduce her to some of my things I liked when I was younger and with varying degrees of success. And then my younger daughter also likes reading, but there's a different style of book now that's huge with kids. They're like semi-picture, semi-narrative. So there's one's called Diary of a Wimpy Kid, but there's a whole series of different authors, but they're a kind of mishmash of comic and fiction, and they're quite funny and clever, but it's a bit different to anything I read when I was a kid. But luckily they do also just like the same kind of swords and sorcery kind of stuff that was around. It's like Tolkien inspired. But we also like read as a family the famous 5 and the classics and things, which are just nice.
That's it for today, and that's it for our very first Sundoku. Have a think about what's in the pile of books by your bed, your Sundoku, and get in touch because we'd love to hear from you.
And you can find us on Facebook and Instagram.
Next time, we feature Australian author Emily Bitto with a road story of an innocent Australian on a journey into the dark heart of American capitalism.
I'll catch you then.
See you later.
This podcast is produced by 4 book addicts who are refusing treatment.
Annie Hastwell,
Kath Keneally,
Sarah Martin,
And me, Michaela Andreev. Our thanks to composer Quincy Grant for the music. And if you want to know more about the books, the authors, or the music featured in this episode, check out the show notes. You can find us on Facebook and Instagram at SundokuCast. That's TSUNDOKU Cast.